Chapter 31 Clark Spring. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Kansas has a humid, temperate climate. Smallville shares this characteristic. At noon, the dense forest is lush, the air crisp and clean, but Clark isn't feeling it. He's walking through the woods with Pete and Chloe, who are up ahead, hunting for bugs, but these bugs are elusive, always disappearing when you're looking for them, only to pop up when you least expect it. After a long search, they only found one. And to top it off, they let it get away. Now Chloe and Pete are bickering and blaming each other. Trailing behind them, Gino playfully draped an arm around Clark's neck, studying his profile with a smile. So, what's got our boy Clark so down? Negative emotions from Clark +50. I'm not a boy, Clark sighed, resigned to Gino's teasing, but his thoughts drifted back to yesterday. After his conversation with the castle, Clark hadn't worked up the nerve to talk to Jonathan, just like Gino predicted, but Jonathan stopped him, took him downstairs, and dropped a bombshell. Clark Kent wasn't from Earth. He was an alien, even though he'd suspected it. Facing the truth was a different story. The comic absurdity of it all overwhelmed Clark. Almost immediately, the name of his kind, his friend, Geno Luthor, surfaced in his mind. Gino's strength was comparable to his own. Did that mean? Clark looked intently at the smiling Gino, gathering his courage. Gino, you're an alien too, aren't you? Gino's smile faltered. First he asked if he was human, and now he's outright asking if he's an alien. Gino sighed, fighting the urge to complain. He realized why Clark was upset. Jonathan must have told him about his origins. The kid was probably reeling. As they walked aimlessly, Gino clapped Clark on the shoulder. Does it even matter? Clark looked surprised, tilting his head. Doesn't it? It matters, but it doesn't. Gino shrugged, removed his arm from Clark's neck, and gazed up at the sky. Clark, your true identity isn't what defines you. It's who you choose to be. Earthling or alien, that's your call. Gino winked, a mysterious smile playing on his lips. Maybe one day, your people will come looking for you. Clark was lost in thought. If that day came, would he go back with them? Crunch. Gino stepped on something. He looked down and saw a dark object hidden beneath the fallen leaves. What's this? Then he picked it up and realized it was a camera. Recalling his brief stint as a photographer, Gino opened a camera and started scrolling through the pictures. His expression grew increasingly strange. Clark, you need to see this. The screen showed Lana Lang, in pink lace pajamas, taking off her clothes. Someone was secretly photographing Clark's childhood crush, and judging by the number of photos, it had been going on for a while. Gino felt a pang of sympathy for Clark. It seemed that Lana had the attention of every male high school student in Smallville. Europeans and Americans weren't as hung up on relationships. Unlike Gino, he only made a move when he was in the lead. What about Talia? Judging from last night's debriefing, she was on board. What? Clark snapped out of his thoughts, realizing they had wandered close to Lana's house. Chloe and Pete were nowhere in sight. He saw Gino standing under a gnarled tree, holding a camera with a peculiar look on his face. And was that pity in his eyes? You need to see this. Gino handed Clark the camera, stepping back to observe his reaction. Confused, Clark took the camera and fumbled with it until he could see the photos. His face flushed crimson. He was looking at a semi-nude photo of Lana. He gasped, his eyes wide. Lana's underwear show had him blushing instantly, but then, his mind caught up, and he realized something was wrong. He studied the photo closely. First, the perspective was from far away. Second, he could see her balcony and a picture frame in the background, proving that she was being secretly photographed. His flushed cheeks turned pale. Clark pursed his lips and clenched his left fist, knuckles cracking. This is disgusting. He furiously scrolled through the photos, finding images dating back to the first day of school. Negative emotions from Clark +100. Gino. Clark looked up at Gino, his voice tight with fury. We have to call the cops. We have to find out who's doing this to Lana. Yeah, you're right, Gino replied casually, nodding behind Clark. But maybe you should put that thing away. The person most concerned about this is here. What? Clark turned to follow Gino's gaze. He saw Lana, looking furious, striding toward them, glancing at the ground as if searching for something. Behind her hobbled Whitney, his arm in a cast. In the distance, Gino and Clark could hear Whitney. "Lana, I was wrong. I shouldn't have said it was just a necklace." "No, Whitney. You don't think you did anything wrong. I don't accept your apology." Lana took a deep breath, turning to face Whitney with a blank expression. "I'm sorry to inform you, Whitney, but we're done." With that, she ignored Whitney's pained expression and resumed her search on the ground. Clark stood there, stunned, unable to believe what he'd just heard. Lana broke up with Whitney. At that moment, Gino's mischievous voice whispered in his ear. "Bad news, Lana's being stalked by a pervert, and she doesn't know it. Good news, Lana's single again. A certain someone has a shot now." Chapter 32 Clues. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Dense forest, a light breeze rustled through the treetops. Lana seemed to notice it and slowly looked up. That she was surprised to see her neighbor there, but when she spotted Clark's friend Gino beside him, she seemed a little embarrassed. Her relationship with Gino hadn't been great because of Whitney. Still, as the popular girl at their small-town high school, Lana walked toward them with a smile. "What are you guys doing out here?" she asked, blinking. Gino glanced at Clark, wondering if he'd thought about the contents of the camera. Clark's cheeks were flushed, and he looked totally flustered. Might as well get it over with. Gino thought, giving Clark a 0 for his awkwardness. He smirked at Lana. "Fancy meeting you here." Lana didn't like the way Gino looked at her. Just then, Whitney caught up. "Lana, and Gino." Whitney looked nervous seeing Gino. He could almost feel his broken arm throbbing. "Whitney," Gino said with a casual nod, acting like he was just saying hello. Then, his eyes flicked between them, and he asked, "Sounds like you two were having a fight." That he hadn't forgotten Lana's earlier insults, and he wasn't about to miss a chance to embarrass them. Sure enough, Lana's pretty face tightened slightly. She glared at Gino's smirk, sure he was doing it on purpose. However, being the girl of Clark's dreams, Lana's cheerful and outgoing personality came through. Without hesitation, she nodded. "Not a fight. Whitney and I broke up." "Oh." Gino drawled, nodding slowly. "Perfect timing. Clark and I have something important to tell you." Ignoring Whitney's awkward expression, Gino pulled Clark away, gesturing for Lana to follow. Watching them go, Whitney clenched his fist inside his sleeve. "Those jerks." Meanwhile. "Looking for me." Lana crossed her arms. She was wearing a brown short-sleeved shirt, and her long, dark hair made her look young and vibrant. Gino glanced at Clark, who was still spaced out. Annoyed, he sharply jabbed Clark in the ribs with his elbow. That would have hurt anyone, but since they were both tough guys, Gino's elbow just made Clark wince. "Ow!" Clark gasped and quickly rubbed his side. When he snapped back to reality, he saw Lana looking at him, curious. "Aha!" Pretending to be cool, Clark dropped his hand, scratched his head, and awkwardly handed over the camera. "Lana, you need to see this." "What is it?" Lana took the camera, and her face clouded over as she saw the photos of her life after getting home. "We found this camera in the crooked tree near your place," Clark said, explaining what happened. Lana stood frozen, a mix of anger, hurt, and fear making her burst into tears. "Hey, Lana, don't cry." Clark instinctively looked at Gino, hoping for advice. Idiot, Gino thought. What she needs is a solid hug, a safe place. Gino gently shoved Clark. "Whoa." Clark stumbled and instinctively grabbed Lana. "Whoa." Surprised by the hug, Lana tensed up, while Clark panicked. He'd never hugged Lana before, and her perfume made his cheeks burn. Just then, Gino chimed in. "Who knows how long that creep's been spying on you?" Lana sobbed harder. This was anyone's worst nightmare. She clung to Clark, crying her eyes out. There was a rustling in the woods. Gino turned to see little Pete and Chloe, eyes wide with shock, covering her mouth. Did we come at a bad time?" Pete stammered. He thought Lana had a boyfriend, but now she was hugging Clark. Chloe's eyes were burning with gossip, and she silently asked Gino what was going on. The high school girls were like Hollywood actresses, always fighting and scheming. Lana might be popular with guys, but plenty of girls hated her, and Chloe was one of them. She thought Lana was a total show-off. Gino shrugged, put his arms around Pete and Chloe's shoulders, and explained the situation. After hearing the story, Chloe looked at Lana with sympathy. She might not like Lana, but she felt bad for her. Do you know anyone who uses cameras around school? Gino asked Chloe, the town's know-it-all thanks to her job as editor of the school paper. A camera. Chloe ruffled her short blonde hair, as if it would help her think. Suddenly, her eyes lit up. I remember Gray sending me a submission once. He wanted to convince everyone to appreciate insects and their beauty, so he sent a bunch of insect photos. Remembering the scene, Chloe shivered. Gray. Gino narrowed his eyes, recalling the short guy he'd seen at the farmer's market. Does anyone know where he lives? Gino was planning a field trip. I do. Little Pete raised his hand. There's a shortcut nearby that leads right to Gray's place. Let's check out his house. Gino motioned for Pete to lead the way and called out to Clark and Lana. You two, break it up and come help us investigate. Hearing Gino's call, Clark reluctantly let go of Lana, who seemed to realize they'd been a little too close. The two of them, still blushing, followed Gino and the others, silent under everyone's gaze. Chapter 33 Investigation. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Gray's place was on the west side of town, near an old abandoned factory. The factory's pollution had driven everyone away years ago. Now, only the Gray family's house stood there, all alone and kind of spooky. Peter stopped the group outside. This is the Gray place. Gino just stared at the house. It was a small, two-story building with white walls. The front door was closed, the windows too grimy to see inside. Lana was clearly excited. She marched right up and banged on the door. Mrs. Ted. You home? Mrs. Ted. Only Lana's voice echoed back. She looked anxious. She really wanted to know if Gray had been secretly filming her. Bang, bang, bang. The door shook with each knock, sending dust falling from the eaves. Chloe sighed, crossing her arms. I heard Gray's dad died in a mining accident. They haven't cleaned this place in ages. Still no answer. The house remained silent, like nobody was home. Move, Gino said calmly, pushing Lana aside. He walked to the door. Crack, star. Gino's fist blurred as he punched. The thick wooden door shattered like paper. Oh my God. Lana stared at the hole, hand flying to her mouth. She looked at Gino's arm, worried. Did that hurt? She instinctively reached out to check it. I'm fine. Gino gave her an indifferent look that stopped her. She pulled her hand back, watching as he felt around inside the door for the lock. He didn't even flinch. Got it. He found the bolt. It was locked from the inside. Click, star. He gently pulled it back. Creak, star. The old door slowly swung open, revealing the inside. Sunlight streamed in, highlighting dust motes dancing in the air. A musty, rotten smell filled the doorway, making several people cover their noses. They all stepped inside. How long has it been since they cleaned? Xiao Hei asked, looking around the messy living room. Broken lampshades were scattered everywhere. A lopsided sofa and shards of glass hinted at something bad happening here. And Gino could smell a faint scent of blood. He and Clark exchanged a look. Something wasn't right. What's that on the table? Chloe, ever observant, pointed to a stack of videotapes on the TV. Pop one in, Gino said, watching as Chloe slipped a tape into the DVD player. The screen flickered, then showed Lana and Whitney chatting and laughing on a picnic. Oh no. Lana's face went white. The picnic was clearly recorded, meaning Gray was definitely the one doing it. Clark's face tightened as he watched Lana on TV. He reached forward and pulled out the tape. Okay, that's enough. We need to figure out what happened here. Hey, I wasn't done watching. Chloe pouted, clearly annoyed that he was interfering with her goddess. But she knew they had to find Gray, so she shrugged and kept quiet. Let's check out the kitchen. Gino's blue eyes were fixed on the doorway around the corner. That strong smell of blood was coming from there. Tap, tap, star. Their sneakers echoed on the floor. As they got closer, a pair of women's high heels came into view, followed by a pair of bare legs. Gino sighed inwardly, already guessing what they'd find. He hurried forward. A woman in a bright dress stared blankly at the ceiling, not because she was still alive, but the swollen face and huge wound in her abdomen showed that she'd been dead for a while. Everyone but the emotionless Gino recoiled in horror. Bloody organs were visible in the gaping chest wound, blood covered the floor and the woman's clothes. The sickening smell of death filled the air. Fear was spreading like a disease. Little Black Pete was the first to crack. The fear was overwhelming. He started screaming, eyes rolling back in his head, body convulsing. He collapsed to the floor with a thud. Chloe wasn't doing much better. Seeing a corpse for the first time, especially one like this, turned her face green. Her stomach churned. Bleg, she clapped a hand over her mouth and raced out of the kitchen. She didn't want to disrespect the dead. She was superstitious like that. Soon, they heard her gagging and crying outside. Not everyone could handle this. Lana, hiding behind Gino, looked terrified and instinctively wanted someone to hold her. Her eyes landed on Gino. Lost in her own thoughts, she took a step forward, reaching for him, but Gino stepped aside, avoiding her embrace. He walked toward the body, even squatting down to examine the wound closely. It was like he was studying a textbook, not a dead body. Lana, face white as a sheet, turned and threw herself into Clark's arms. Clark, I'm scared. Even though he was terrified too, Clark puffed out his chest, trying not to look like a wimp in front of the goddess. Gino, maybe we should go. Clark swallowed hard, feeling uneasy. He swore Mrs. Ted's eyes were following him. Leave. Just because of a dead body. Gino scoffed, breaking off a piece of wood from the door and holding it in his hand. These kids were too soft. What would they do if they saw him blow someone's head off? But if you're scared, you can wait in the living room. Chapter 34 Plan. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Ugh. A wooden stick pressed against a bloodshot gray eyeball. The stick easily crushed it, like squeezing the pulp out of a cooked sheep's eye. Buzz. A few nasty flies buzzed out of the insect-eaten socket. Thwack. Star. Gino tossed the stick and swatted the oversized flies away. Lana. Without turning around, Gino ordered, call the cops. Huh. Lana, peeking out from behind Clark, nodded quickly and bolted from the room. Every second in there felt like forever. Clark. Gino stopped Clark, who was about to follow Lana. Something's off here. Heads up. Clark paused, fighting his nausea, and joined Gino. Seeing the abnormally large flies, he asked, like that electro guy from the bridge? Gray's got powers too. Looks like he's got some kind of special ability. Gino glanced at the muddy shoe prints on the ceiling. Let's check upstairs. They found Gray's room quickly. Insect posters covered the walls, creepy and weird. Stepping on broken glass, Gino noticed large, white cocoons in each corner. They pulsed slightly, like something was inside. Clark, open that one, Gino said, pointing to a cocoon near the bed. Clark stepped up, grimacing at the wet feeling of the silk, and ripped it open. Ryup, starred at a desiccated face appeared. The whole body looked mummified, completely drained of moisture and flesh. Mouth agape. Oh my God, Clark recoiled, looking at Gino. He's dead. Yeah, he's dead. Gino examined the corpse's tattered clothes, like a homeless guy. Strange tattoos covered the withered arms. His gaze landed on the neck wound. Something had bitten deep, a nasty gash exposing the neck's inner workings. After a moment, Gino concluded, this guy was probably a vagrant. Gray sucked him dry. Clark clenched his fists, anger flashing in his eyes. Gray did this. Ignoring the question, Gino continued his analysis. Looks like his mutation needs a lot of human flesh and blood to fuel it. Clark gently lowered the mummy, faced Geno, and said firmly, "We have to stop him." "Geno, what do we do?" Meeting Clark's intense stare, Geno hesitated. He thought of a dumb DC joke. Whenever Superman had a problem, he consulted his superbrain. The superbrain always answered, "Why not ask the smart Batman?" Geno sighed. If this kept up, every crisis would end with Superman's superbrain saying, "Ask Geno what to do." He walked to Clark and clapped him on the shoulder. "You know why I asked you to take Lana with you?" "What do you mean?" Clark seemed to understand. "Exactly. Gray's a creep obsessed with Lana." Geno put his arm around Clark's shoulders and steered him to the window. They could see Chloe squatting, looking shell-shocked, and Lana on the phone. Geno chuckled. "As long as we watch Lana, Gray will come running. Think about it. If some ordinary guy suddenly gets terrifying powers, he'll act on all those twisted thoughts he's been suppressing." Geno released Clark, clasped his hands behind his back, and stared at the chemical plant in the distance. A long-suffering nobody suddenly has extraordinary abilities. He's itching to unleash all that pent-up rage. What better way to feel like a winner than to score the girl of his dreams? Clark, deep in thought, looked at Geno with admiration. He couldn't fathom how Geno pieced things together. "Okay, nothing more to see here. Let's go." Geno led Clark out. As they left, he glanced at the cocoons. If Gray shot those silk threads from his wrists, maybe they should call him Spider-Man. Clark carried the unconscious Pete on his back. Outside, a pale Chloe stood clutching her stomach, giving Geno a complicated look. "Seriously, Geno, you're made of steel. I don't know how you can look at dead bodies without throwing up." Clark nodded, equally curious about what could actually faze Geno. "Guys, I called the police. They'll be here soon," Lana said, hanging up and walking towards them, her brown eyes filled with sadness. She sighed. "I can't believe Mrs. Ted is gone." Everyone fell silent. Witnessing death had put a damper on things, except for Geno, who was fiddling with his phone, apparently texting someone. 10 minutes later, a police car pulled up, and two cops, one fat and one skinny, got out. Clark frowned. He recognized them from when they questioned him about Whitney's broken arm. "Who called it in?" The cops eyed the four young people, looking like clueless high schoolers. Their attitude was dismissive. Weekend calls were a waste of their time, and they weren't about to fake enthusiasm. "I did, officer," Geno said, stopping Lana from stepping forward. The cop saw Geno's face and instantly turned friendly and eager. "Mr. Geno. What can we do for you?" "Someone's dead inside," Geno said, pointing to the house. "The deceased is Mrs. Ted, Gray Ted's mother." The cops exchanged glances, their expressions turning serious. The murder case was no joke. Chapter 35 Waiting for the Rabbit. You are listening at novelfull.audio. News of Mrs. Ted's death spread like wildfire through town in a matter of hours. In a place so small and uneventful, any bit of gossip traveled fast, let alone the shocking suspicion that Mrs. Ted had been murdered. The local police, after searching the Ted house and discovering the mummies, were completely out of their depth. They decided to keep things quiet and call for backup from the higher-ups. The town's peace was shattered, everything felt chaotic. Meanwhile, in Lana's room, the curtains were drawn, blocking any view from the outside. Clark, clearly nervous, perched on the edge of Lana's bed, stealing glances around her room. He'd embarrassed himself by peeping at her with a telescope before, but he had his limits. Once Lana was inside, he stopped looking. This was the first time he'd actually seen her space. "Want something to eat?" Lana came in carrying a tray of fruit, smiling. "I'm making pizza, but it won't be ready for a while." "Thanks." Clark grabbed an apple, politely, and eyed Geno, who was sitting quietly in the corner. "You want some?" "Not hungry." Geno shook his head, his eyes closed. He was pretty sure kryptonite was behind Gray's mutation. Lana set down the tray, a grateful look on her face. "Thanks for staying with me." Her gaze lingered on Geno. It was his idea to keep her home. She even felt a little guilty about how she treated him before. He was a good guy. "All right, time for you to get some sleep." Geno nodded, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was midnight. You'll be here, right? Lana was tense, clutching her clothes. We'll be outside, keeping watch. Clark stood up after Gino, wanting to reassure her. Someone flipped off the lights as they left, plunging the room into darkness. Lana did as Gino told her, slowly closing her eyes in bed. Her eyes fluttered. Everything that had happened that day had her on edge, especially Gino's warning that Gray might come for her. Her fear intensified. Lana tossed and turned, the day's events replaying in her mind like a movie. Shoo! A sound outside the window, like the wind blowing leaves against the glass. Lana stiffened, her breathing quickening. Could it be him? Tap, tap, tap. Something was tapping on the glass, faster and faster, scaring Lana. She gripped the blanket tightly, wanting to pull it over her head and disappear, but the tapping kept coming. In the still of the night, in the dark of the room, the sound faded slightly, but that strange silence only made her heart pound harder, her mouth go dry, after a moment. Scratch. The sound started again, but this time it was like something was cutting the glass, making a horrible noise. Smash! Something crashed into the room, and a foul, swampy odor filled the air. Lana. Gray's voice, deeper than usual, echoed. A figure looked at Lana, yearningly. As it walked towards her, it said, "I'm taking you away, so you can be my bride." The figure got closer, and Lana could hear his ragged breathing, just as she was about to scream. Click! The lights flipped on, chasing away the darkness and revealing the scene. A creepy guy in a black jacket, with his hair slicked back, was reaching out a pale hand towards Lana. Blinded by the sudden light, Gray instinctively threw up his arms to shield his eyes. Squinting, he glared at Gino and Clark, standing in the doorway. Then his eyes turned dark. "What are you two doing here?" Seeing Yuchi there in Lana's house, reminded Gray of the scenes in the pornos he had watched. The thought of his crush being with another man made him look ugly with anger. "That Gray Ted?" Gino ignored Gray's question, studying him intently. Compared to his old, sloppy self, this guy was taller, and his appearance had changed. The acne was gone, at least. A smirk played on Gino's lips. "How'd your mother taste?" Gray flinched at the question, then, he grinned, revealing his teeth. "To be honest, pretty damn good." So they'd been to his house, found out his secret. That made them all the more likely to die. Making up his mind, Gray held out his hands. His arms twisted and deformed, transforming into a pair of sharp, mantis-like blades. "And hearing you talk like that's made me hungry. You two are pretty big, you'll make a good dinner." With a guttural scream, Gray launched himself forward, a gust of wind preceding him, and raised his bladed arms to strike their necks. He'd slice them open, drink their blood, taste their flesh, and then take his bride. In that moment, Gray flew through the air like a blur. 5 meters, 4 meters, 3 meters, closer and closer, a look of crazed anticipation on his face. He could practically see their headless bodies. Then, Gray saw something that terrified him. Gino's blue eyes were locked on him. How could he follow his movements so easily? Confused, his brain struggling to process what was happening, Gino made his move. "What makes you think you can kill me?" Gino's voice was calm, but his right hand shot out, fast as lightning, and grabbed Gray's bladed arms. Bang! A swift over-the-shoulder throw sent Gray crashing to the floor. The force of the impact shattered the floorboards. Clark stumbled, falling into the living room below, along with Gino and Gray. This is impossible." Gray groaned in pain, his arms pinned by Gino, staring up at that calm face in horror. "Nothing is impossible." Gino shook his head, lifted Gray, and slammed him against the floor again. Bang! 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 The relentless blows shattered the floor. Along with Lana's screams, a dizzy Gray provided the backdrop for the Hulk versus the Second Prince of Asgard. Chapter 36 Reckless Clark. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Bang, 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 a rhythmic pounding echoed through the room. Sawdust exploded in the air as Gino moved with such speed that the Gray he held seemed to blur into an afterimage. Boom, another brutal impact. Gray, nose busted, face swollen, and bloodied, lay motionless on the splintered floorboards. "Honestly, you disgust me." Gino planted a foot on Gray's face, grinding it into the debris. Clark watched in silence, a flicker of grim familiarity in his eyes. He'd seen that look on Gino's face before. "Your mom raised you for 18 years, just for you to end up getting yourself killed," Gino sneered, staring down at Gray. He grabbed Gray's collar and hauled him up, raising a fist as terror flooded Gray's eyes. Gino clenched his fist, the power coiled in his arm making the veins bulge. A primal fear surged through Gray. One hit from that fist, and he was dead. "You're done," Gino said, sealing Gray's fate. He could keep Gray, toss him to Lex, who'd lock him away in the deep, dark experimental lab under his factory. But he didn't want to let something like this live. The massive fist loomed larger in Gray's vision, closer and closer. Don't kill me." Gray screamed. The fist was a hair's breadth from Gray's cheek. Smack! A hand slammed against Gino's fist, stopping it. The impact sent a shockwave of air rippling outwards. The force of it made Gray squint. He opened his eyes and saw Clark, the one who'd saved him. He didn't know why this fool had stopped his friend, but he wasn't about to waste the opportunity to escape. "Hold on, Gino, we can't just kill him. We gotta hand him over to the cops." Clark's face was set, serious. He couldn't stand by and watch a man die in front of him. Gino turned his gaze, icy, on Clark. "Clark, I'm only saying this once, let him go." Meeting Gino's cold stare, Clark felt a knot tighten in his gut, but he stood his ground. "We're just regular citizens. We don't have the right to decide who lives and dies." "Oh, really?" Gino shook his head, a humorless smile twisting his lips. "And what do you think will happen to him if we hand him over?" Gino continued before Clark could respond. "He'll disappear into some Black Ops military lab. They'll study every change in his body, then he'll die on a table. And this town? Forget about peace. The military will tear this place apart trying to figure out its secrets. So, killing him now? It's for his own good, and for everyone else's." Gino's smile was almost gentle. "So, don't get in my way." "No, you can't." Clark stood firm, arguing with Gino, but just as Clark opened his mouth to speak, Gray, who had been lying on the floor playing possum, suddenly leaped to his feet. He jumped on Clark's back. "Ha! You two suckers," Gray snarled. Without Clark buying him time, he wouldn't have had a chance to alter his body structure and put his escape plan into motion. Gray spread his arms, and the black jacket he wore rippled as if in a high wind. His body exploded, transforming into a swarm of flies that buzzed towards the second floor and out through the shattered window. It all happened in a split second. Gino could only watch helplessly as the swarm of insects vanished into the night. He got away. Clark looked like he'd seen a ghost, clearly not expecting Gray to be able to turn into a cloud of bugs. "Yeah, thanks to you." Gino shoved Clark's hand away. "Thanks to your help, a few more innocent people are gonna die because of him." Clark was a good friend, kind, shy, gentle, but too damn soft sometimes. Being kind to your enemies is being cruel to yourself. Clark started to speak, but seeing Clark's guilty expression, Gino lost it. He cocked back his fist and punched him hard. Bang! The punch landed square on Clark's face, sending him staggering, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. Negative emotions from Clark plus 100. Clark's cheek throbbed with burning pain, but you gotta own up when you mess up, and take your lumps when you deserve. He was the one who let Gray escape, putting everyone in danger, so Clark just clenched his jaw, said nothing, and hung his head in shame. "Are you okay?" Lana, looking anxious, clutched a pillow to her chest, taking in the wreckage of her living room. She was already dreading her aunt's reaction, but that wasn't important right now. Lana bit her lip and asked, "Did you catch him?" "I just saw a swarm of flies fly out of my room." Gino didn't answer, just stared up at the gaping hole in the wall. Clark couldn't stand the silence any longer. He had acted like a fool, his pride wounded. Clark mumbled, "I'll take care of this." Then, he bolted out of the house, moving so fast he was a blur. What? Lana stared in disbelief. How can Clark be so fast? You don't need to know. Just keep it to yourself. Gino glanced at Lana, then pulled out his phone and made a call. Hey, Lex, I need a favor. 20 minutes later, Lana hugged her pillow and watched as a construction crew streamed in and out of her house. Thank goodness her aunt was at Mrs. Ted's funeral tonight. Lana had a feeling her ears would be ringing later, she thought, then she saw Gino under the crooked tree in the distance. So, you want the chemical factory to produce some pesticides? Lex raised his eyebrows. Gino shook his head. Not just any pesticide. I need a concentrated formula. High dosage. Enough to kill bugs within 100 yards. Bit of a hassle, but not a problem. Lex rubbed his chin. Just remember, I want the body when you're done with him. My experiments are starting to show some promise. Gino knew Lex meant the lab and nodded. So what's the plan? Lex pulled a cigarette from his pack and lit it. His mind was already racing, figuring out how to cook up some insecticide. Chapter 37 Gray's Plan. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Late, inside a gym packed with weightlifting equipment, a guy sat hunched on a stool, a dumbbell dangling from his hand. He slowly began to swing it back and forth. Ugh, he grimaced, straining to lift the weight, but a sharp pain shot through him, radiating from where the bones had knitted back together after being in the hospital. Hiss. Whitney gasped. The pain made it impossible to grip the dumbbell. It slipped from his grasp with a dull clang. Shit, Whitney roared, leaping to his feet and kicking the dumbbell away in fury. Gino's cold, mocking face flashed in his mind. His eyes burned with resentment. Gino Luthor. I'm gonna get you. If it wasn't for Gino, he'd still be captain of the football team, still king of the campus. Interesting. A voice, cold and detached, cut through the air behind him. Whitney jumped, his body trembling. His gaze darted to the mirrored wall. He saw a figure cloaked in a black jacket, arms crossed, watching him. Gray. Whitney was shocked by Gray's transformation. The short, awkward kid he remembered was gone, replaced by someone taller, with softer features. Then the news that had swept through town this afternoon hit him like a punch. Mrs. Ted was dead, murdered, and the suspect was her own son, Gray. He was alone with a killer. What do you want? His body shook uncontrollably, his teeth chattered. Fear clawed at him, making him feel like he was surrounded by ghosts. The air in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees, Gray waved a dismissive hand. Relax, Whitney. He licked his lips. I was gonna snack on you to recharge, but I changed my mind. You hate Gino, and I hate him too. That makes us buddies. As he spoke, Gray casually opened Whitney's fridge, grabbed a hunk of raw beef, and stuffed it into his mouth, chewing and swallowing with relish. Whitney's hatred for Gino was enough to earn him a temporary stay of execution. Finished eating and drinking, Gray wiped the raw meat juice from the corners of his mouth. Hope that sits well with you tonight. After leveling Whitney with a chilling stare, Gray casually opened the window. Wait. Whitney grit his teeth, forcing down his terror. You said you hate Gino, but what about Clark? Gray's brow furrowed. With a sickeningly smooth motion, he rotated his neck a full 180 degrees, fixing Whitney with a baleful stare. In a soft, deadly voice, Gray whispered, I hate him too. As a romantic rival, Gray couldn't stand the way Clark looked at Lana. Lana was his, and any man who dared to lay claim to her would pay the ultimate price. Okay, I'll help you, Whitney said, his eyes hardening. Help me? Gray sneered, looking Whitney up and down as if he were nothing more than a pile of garbage. Just a sec, I know Clark's weakness. Whitney saw the contempt in Gray's eyes, but swallowed his pride. My ex used to have a necklace. Shut it. Gray snapped, cutting him off. He jabbed a finger at Whitney. Say her name. Whitney ground his teeth. Fine, Lana had an emerald necklace. She wore it all the time. I noticed that whenever Lana got close to Clark, he'd turn pale as a ghost. Yeah, Whitney said, remembering the times Lana had been near Clark, it looked like every time Clark got close to Lana, he would get really weak. That morning when Lana dumped me and ran into Clark, he was totally fine. That day, Lana lost her necklace. Whitney presented his theory. Gray listened, his brow furrowed. He replayed his observations of Lana. It was true, Clark always seemed weakened when Lana wore that necklace, and Gray thought back to the beating he had taken from Gino this evening, and Clark was able to take a punch from Gino, which meant that the opponent was not an ordinary person. As he considered this, a vicious scheme began to form in Gray's mind. A cruel smile twisting his lips, Gray turned his gaze back to Whitney. Describe that necklace. Every detail. Whitney paused, thinking. Lana said it was a family heirloom. Supposedly, it glows green at night. It looked like agate or maybe emerald. It was really strange, some kind of stone. As Whitney's description grew more detailed, Gray's smile widened. He knew there were stones that matched that description in the glass box he used to grow his bugs. Got it, Gray interrupted, a cruel edge to his voice. With an effortless leap, he disappeared into the night outside the window. Run. Run like hell, the road beneath his feet, the trees around him, the air itself, everything blurred past at blinding speed. The wind whipped at his t-shirt, and Clark pumped his arms, slicing through the night like a human bullet. He ran without direction, his mind was a jumble of images, Gino's rage, Lana's disappointment, Gray's mockery, his father's teachings. What a fool I am. Suddenly, Clark stopped. The abrupt halt made the branches of a nearby tree rustle. Arg! Clark roared, smashing his fist against the tree trunk. Bang! The force of the blow shattered the tree, sending splinters flying. Clark unleashed a flurry of punches against the ruined tree. What should I do? What's the right thing to do? His father taught him to be kind, to respect life, and to protect the weak, but Gino told him to show no mercy to his enemies, to crush them without hesitation. This internal conflict tore at Clark's young heart. He could only vent his rage on himself. Even though he'd declared he'd handle it, he had no idea how to track Gray, let alone bring him to justice. So, Clark blamed himself for not being decisive, not being smart enough. Bang, 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 each punch echoed through the night. The tree couldn't withstand the assault of the Kryptonian, and soon collapsed into a pile of broken wood. Huff. Clark dropped his fists, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. Having a bad day, a voice spoke behind him. Clark's eyes narrowed. Without turning around, he ripped a branch from the tree and hurled it backward. Then, Clark spun around, fixing a cold stare on Gray's flickering form in the moonlight. Murderer! How dare you show your face? It's because I missed you, Clark. Gray contorted his waist and hips, dodging the branch like it was nothing, a sinister grin plastered across his face. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of stones that glowed with an eerie green light. I brought you a little present. I think you'll like it. Chapter 38 Kidnapped Clark. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Early morning, two deck chairs sit on the sprawling lawn. Keno, shirtless and wearing a pair of loud Hawaiian pants, was reclined on one, eyes closed. The gentle sunlight bathed him, making the young man look like he was dusted with gold. He loved soaking up the sun. Whenever the sun hit his skin, he felt like he was getting stronger. 13 years of sunbathing, he mused. Time to unlock some powers, right? If that doesn't work, maybe I'll just bake in the desert for a month. Looking a bit sulky, Keno extended his right hand. Almost immediately, a maid placed a glass of milk in it. He took a sip, then he turned to the young maid and chuckled, "Thanks." Buzzed out. A brief tingle shot through him, and the world blurred and warped, the colors draining away like an old movie. "You're welcome," the maid replied. As she took the glass, Keno could see right through her pretty face. He saw the skeleton moving beneath her skin, like an X-ray, and the heart beating inside her chest. Everything was so clear, the flowing blood, the firing nerves. No secrets remained hidden from his gaze. Master, the maid looked at Keno, a little flustered by his stare. It's nothing, Keno said, snapping back to reality and closing his eyes again, his expression calm, but the small curve at the corner of his mouth betrayed his good mood. Finally, clairvoyance. He opened his eyes again, turning his gaze to the maid's undergarments, a black maid's dress paired with lacy mesh underwear. Seductive and hot, not bad, Keno thought. Pretty useful ability, at the very least, he could use it to check out people's underwear and figure out their personalities. While Keno was admiring the maids mowing the lawn in the distance, the old butler appeared silently behind him. What is it? Keno asked without turning around. Sir, 2 matters. Miss Lana is awake. She's had breakfast and is looking for you. Keno nodded. Bring her over. Since Lana's house was destroyed last night and there was the risk of Gray escaping, Keno had been forced to put her up for the night at his family's castle. Also, Mr. Jonathan Kent is here to see you. He's waiting outside the manor. Jonathan? Keno frowned. Clark's dad. Is he here to give me a lecture about Clark? Let him in too. Keno was curious about Jonathan's visit. After all, the man had always seen the Luthors as a curse. Keno closed his eyes again, drifting off. Soon, it seemed like the sunlight dimmed. He opened his eyes to see Lana standing in front of him, hands behind her back, smiling. You're blocking my son, Keno said, pushing her aside without ceremony. The girl was taken aback. She could tell he didn't like her, but gratitude was due. Lana stood next to him and followed his gaze to the distant grassland. Thank you for your help yesterday, she said. It's fine. Clark's my friend, Keno replied, shaking his head. He looked at Lana and added, he's a good kid. At least, better than her ex-boyfriend, Star. Yes, Lana said, sighing quietly as she looked at Keno. The atmosphere grew quiet, until the butler rushed onto the lawn with Jonathan, who looked hurried and serious. Mr. Kent, Keno said, standing up to show respect for Clark's adoptive father. Keno, Jonathan said, looking at him with a complicated expression. He pursed his lips. Is Clark here? Clark. Keno frowned. Shouldn't he have gone home last night? Although Clark had said he'd take care of investigating Gray, Keno had just seen it as youthful enthusiasm. He hadn't expected Clark to be gone all night. It wasn't like him. While he often butted heads with Jonathan, he loved his mom, Martha. If he really wasn't coming home, he'd at least leave her a message, so, eliminate the impossible, and what's left must be the truth. Clark might be in trouble, Did Gray get him? Most people didn't know, but Keno knew that Gray's transformation came from kryptonite, so, if Gray ran into Clark while carrying kryptonite, Clark was in for a bad time. Jonathan left, looking worried. Clark's missing? Lana asked. Missing, Keno confirmed, his expression darkening. Without Clark, who am I going to get negative points from? That idiot Talia, We need to find Gray. Keno's face was grim. He turned to the butler. Get me a map of the town. The butler nodded and quickly ordered the maids to bring it. Wow. The town map was spread out before Keno. Scanning it, he silently analyzed Gray's possible hiding places. First off, the mummies in Gray's house suggested he was operating nearby. The town itself was too populated. It was unlikely Gray would hide in the center. Keno started eliminating unlikely options. As the number of possibilities dwindled, Keno's eyes settled on an abandoned factory not far from Gray's house. Could it be here? Keno tapped the map with his finger. He stood up slowly, looking towards the northwest. A steel behemoth loomed in the early morning sun. Abandoned factory, dust-covered, defunct machine sat rusting. Rusty supports were the testament of its age. Clark, naked from the waist up, was chained to a thick iron pole with a piece of green kryptonite hanging on his chest. Countless spiderwebs filled the factory. Gray, looking like a human spider, was hanging upside down on the webs, his legs together, staring at the kryptonite on Clark's chest. A sneer twisted his lips. Did you think you could be bait to lure your rich friend? Clark was in pain. Beads of sweat rolled down his face, hitting the steel with a tap-dong sound. You won't succeed, Clark managed to choke out, lifting his head with difficulty, his eyes glazed over. Keno's smart. He'll never let a monster like you get away. As he spoke, Clark looked at the mummies on the ground, consumed with guilt. Gray had kidnapped these innocent people at night and eaten their flesh and blood in front of him. I'm not scared. Gray sneered at Clark's words, reaching into his pocket and pulling out more kryptonite. He shook it, the pieces clinking together. When I catch that guy, I'm going to eat you all together. A manic gleam filled Gray's eyes as he imagined possessing Keno's godlike power. Chapter 39 Holding. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Time has a way of slipping by without you even noticing. Gray clutched a piece of paper, tied it to a bug, and sent it flying towards Luthor Castle. A greasy smile spread across Gray's face as he watched it go. He closed his eyes, savoring the moment. He loved using his brain. It made him feel like the smartest guy in town, eating Geno and Clark's flesh, absorbing their genes. That was going to make him even stronger. Insects squirmed under the surface of Gray's skin. Snap star, someone tripped the spider silk perimeter he'd set up around the factory. Gray's eyes snapped open, a sardonic smirk twisting his lips. Showtime. He didn't know why Geno had come so soon, but Gray was ready. Thump, star, Gray dropped like a bug from the rafters, landing hard on the metal floor. He crouched low, scurrying behind a thick steel pipe. Hidden from view, the spot gave him a perfect vantage point over the entire factory, a blind spot where he could ambush anyone coming in. Ugh! Clark hung suspended in the air, his face green. He tried to yell a warning to Geno, but he was too weak and in too much pain. He could only watch as Gray's arms morphed into razor-sharp blades. Despair filled Clark's eyes. He couldn't let his friend die because of him. The factory was silent, broken only by Clark's pained groans, the hum of the webs in the wind, and the slow, heavy footsteps approaching. Ha! Gray's breathing grew ragged, his grip tight on the kryptonite. He was set. As soon as Geno appeared, he'd pounce, shoving the kryptonite into him. Just like Clark, he'd crumble. Thud, star, the footsteps grew closer, faster, like the guy was in a hurry. Closer. Gray tensed, ready to strike like a praying mantis, but then the footsteps stopped. What the? Gray frowned, but before he could react, an iron can came flying out of nowhere, a blur of motion headed straight for his face. Smack. The can hit him hard. His head swam. A tooth shattered, spraying blood and fragments across the floor. He didn't get it. How had he been spotted? He slammed against the steel pipe. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the can bounce on the floor, and then, bang, star, the can exploded, spewing a cloud of thick, green gas that swept across the factory like a tidal wave. What the? Gray sucked in a breath. Ugh! The green gas burned its way down his throat. His insides were on fire, a searing pain that made him scream. It was itchy, so itchy. Every inch of his skin crawled. Gray flailed, clawing at himself. His sharp claws tore through skin and muscle, drawing blood. He ripped and scratched, quickly turning himself into a bloody mess. This gas. Gray's body convulsed. His head spun. Gotta get out of here. He struggled to stand, but then, things got worse. Swish, star, dozens more cans rained down, blanketing the factory in another wave of green fog. The entire place became a green sea, impossible to see through. Damn you, Geno Luthor! Gray shrieked. As the fog thickened, his skin began to crack and split open, and dead cockroaches, flies, and other insects spilled out of the wounds. Pain, weakness, helplessness. Gray finally understood what Clark was going through, and then, through the fog, Gray heard heavy breathing. Hush. A figure in a protective suit. A gas mask, silver-gray suit. He was walking slowly towards Gray, hands casually behind his back. Geno wasn't rushing anything. After pinpointing Gray's location on the map 5 minutes ago, he'd come to the factory to check things out. Finding Gray hidden and Clark hanging in the air, Geno hadn't jumped right in to rescue them. First, he'd run to Lex's lab, grab dozens of genetic bombs designed specifically for Gray, and then come back to deliver them personally. Now, in his lead-line suit, Geno casually watched the bloody, monstrous Gray. "You look like crap." Geno strolled closer, a smile playing on his lips. He knew Gray had kryptonite, so he'd worn a suit to block its effects. Besides, Gray was practically dead. He stood just a few feet away, mocking him without a trace of fear. "You bastard." Gray's brain finally put 2 and 2 together. The green smoke, it was bug spray, targeted at him. "Why, thank you." Geno twirled the last can of insecticide in his hand, stepping closer to Gray like a villain in a movie. "Last time, you got away because Clark was stupid. Now he's dangling up there, and nobody can save you." Gray struggled to focus, his pus-filled eyes finding Clark in the rafters. If he hadn't tied Clark up, would he still have a chance? "Don't look at me like that. You don't deserve any pity." Geno sneered, grabbing Gray's chin. His fingers tightened, forcing open the monster's shattered jaw. "Here we go. Hold still." Geno jammed the can into Gray's mouth, then, he flipped the switch, watching the horror and despair fill Gray's eyes. Green smoke poured into Gray's mouth, flooding his lungs. As consciousness faded, Gray heard Geno chuckle. "I wonder if Lex can still do anything with this body, now that it's completely rotten." The guy was already thinking about what to do with his corpse. Thanks to reader 1455147117727412224 for the 600-point reward. Thank you, boss. Super loud plus bow plus serious face plus sincere face. Chapter 40 Human Gene Clark Gene. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 40 Human Gene plus Clark Gene equals, Clark woke up from a bizarre dream. In it, a creepy, gray-skinned alien held him by the neck while a guy dressed as a bat grabbed the alien. "Darkseid is here to stay." The hideous figure roared, blasting Clark with a scorching beam from his eyes. "Ah!" Clark yelled, the dream so real it left him in a cold sweat. His vision cleared, and he heard the rustling of footsteps on dirt. Lush trees and damp soil surrounded him, and the cool morning air filled his lungs, making him shiver. He was being carried on someone's back. The back was broad and strong, like being held in his father's arms as a kid. "You awake? Walk yourself now," a familiar, indifferent voice said from ahead, strangely comforting. Thump, Geno set him down. Clark stumbled on the wet ground and stood up, gazing at Geno's back with mixed feelings. Geno's attitude stung, but Clark knew he'd messed up. Kind-hearted as he was, Clark knew what he had to do. "Geno," Clark said, looking like a kid who'd been caught doing something wrong. "I'm sorry. I screwed up. Gray attacked me last night. He killed a lot of people." "Yeah." Hearing Clark's apology, Geno sighed. He turned to face Clark, his eyes sincere. Walking over, he just clapped Clark on the shoulder. "Don't let it happen again." "Okay." Geno smiled, not really believing it. Clark's kindness meant he'd probably do the same thing again, but that was Clark. People are who they are. Forcing someone to change just because you want them to is a load of crap. Geno liked that Clark was kind. There weren't enough good people in the world, and it was fine with him if Clark stayed one. They walked in silence for a bit. "Geno," Clark said, breaking the quiet. He hesitated. "How's Lana?" "She's fine. She crashed at my castle all night." Geno glanced at Clark. "You might want to figure out how you're gonna explain to Jonathan and Martha why you didn't come home." Clark froze. He sucked in a breath. "Oh man, I forgot. Offending Jonathan wasn't a big deal." Clark had argued with his dad plenty of times, but if Martha was mad, both he and Jonathan would be in the doghouse. "I gotta go." Clark scratched his head, embarrassed. "I'll have you over for dinner sometime." After all this, Clark clearly saw Gino as a true friend. All right. Gino just nodded, watching Clark speed off. Once Clark was gone, Gino strolled back to his castle. The old housekeeper told him Lana had already left, so Gino sauntered into the hall. He hadn't gone far when he spotted three guys in suits and glasses, dripping with cologne and wearing fancy watches, typical big city white-collar types. Whoa, company? Gino raised an eyebrow, smiling. He grabbed a glass of milk from a maid and took a sip. Mr. Gino, the lead guy said, puffing out his chest. We've been waiting for Mr. Lex for an hour. He hasn't shown. Domini, I don't get involved in company stuff. Gino shook his head, playing the rich kid. He picked up a pool cue, twirling it, his eyes teasing the three men. What did my dad send you here for? Well. Let me guess. Gino leaned over and easily sunk a yellow ball. The company's losing money. The Luthors owned a ton of property in Smallville, and Gino knew Lex had been siphoning off cash for his experiments. Yes, Domini, one of Lionel's assistants, said, adjusting his glasses. Mr. Lionel believes Mr. Lex plans drastic layoffs. Ha, you're gonna be disappointed. Gino chuckled. His brother always had his own ideas, maybe too many. If I were you, I'd just leave now. You won't see him today. If Gino was right, Lex was probably poking around Gray's body at his secret lab. Ugh. Domini's face went red with frustration. Of course, he wasn't mad at Gino, but at the arrogant Lex. As Lionel's assistant, Domini knew just how bad the relationship between Lionel and Lex was. Taking a deep breath, he waved his guys off. In that case, I'll tell Mr. Lionel what's going on. The three left the castle, and Gino tossed aside his cue and called some maids to massage his shoulders. He closed his eyes and relaxed, soon hearing quick footsteps, fast and determined. Gino knew his brother was coming. Lex walked into the hall, shrugging off his shirt and suit. He glanced at Gino, sprawled on the sofa as maids massaged his legs. Those jerks gone? Yep, but I'm guessing the person you hate most will be here soon. Gino shrugged. Get ready for another screaming match. Ha, he doesn't get how amazing this experiment is, and I'm not letting him in on it, Lex sneered, brushing off his dad. He looked down on his dad, and his dad thought Lex was always trying to undermine him. If you had to describe their relationship in one word, it'd be messy. So, how's the experiment going? Gino chuckled and waved. The maids bowed and left, leaving only Gino and Lex in the hall. Lex's eyes burned when Gino mentioned the project. You can't imagine. You know those Kryptonians? Their stuff can actually change human genes, giving people all kinds of crazy powers. So, Gino spread his hands. Lex leaned on the table, thoughtfully holding his chin. What if I used kryptonite to boost the DNA of those shapeshifters, plus that Clark gene you mentioned? What could I create?